Diversity as a statement of values. As we engage these conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, it becomes extremely important to have a touchstone, right? It's something that we can all agree to, given the diversity of political persuasions, ideologies. Uh, it becomes really difficult, oftentimes, particularly in organizations, to think about diversity in really critical and fundamental ways. And so one of the things that we recommend is that we start with our values. So our organizational values are the things that drive us towards success. And so this session really is going to be about us aligning our intentions, our behaviors, and our values. So as we get into this, there are a couple of objectives that I really want to spend some time with. One is discussing your personal commitment to values when interacting with a diverse world, and recognizing similarities of values across diverse patient and employee populations. It's also important to recognize that we're when thinking about diversity and inclusion, there are a couple of concepts that I think are paramount. One is that diversity is honoring and accounting for our commonalities and our differences. And that inclusion is creating environments where individuals can give their collective best and reach their full potential. And so when we think about those particular ways of looking at diversity and inclusion, hopefully through this presentation, you'll see why thinking about diversity and inclusion in those ways become extremely important and valuable tools to helping us to become more effective. And so one of the things that we know is that our values give us directions, right? They give us a direction, a way to behave, a way to think, a way to operate in the world. And so if you heard a patient say, I don't want that black blood, what about your values would inform you? Now, many of us have never been in a situation like that. Being prepared to address that and comment on a question like that may take many of us by surprise. And our first reaction may be to say or do nothing. But what we do know is that our values give us direction. And so in a situation, if you have some values, how might you address this situation? I'll give you some tools in just a second. Values give us guidance, right? So a coworker says, wow, those don't look like scrubs on her. How would you respond, right? How would you respond? And what organizational values do you have that would dictate to you how you should respond, right? So what organizational values do you have that should dictate to you how you should respond? When we think about values, I want us to come back to this notion that we all have similar values. Many of our values are very similar. So in this exercise, what I'd like for you to do is to drive 5 circles. I want you to drive 5 circles and put one thing that you value in each one of those circles. All right? One thing that you value in each one of those circles. What I also want you to do is to look at the map and select one of those regions. And I want you to put a check by each region that you could draw a facsimile of this on your paper, or use the handout that's been provided to you, or the PDF that's in the course. But I want you to put a check mark by all of the regions that you think they may value some of those same things that you value, that may value some of the same things, right? And if you're in a room with other people, I want you to check with other folks and see if there are folks in the room that also value what you wrote on your paper. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is that we may all value very similar things. What are we after? We're after safety, we're after significance, and we're after belonging. Significance suggests that I am a person with power, with a commitment to, I'm a person with purpose and power, committed to enacting in the world, interacting in the world. That I want to belong to groups of people who understand or appreciate my significance, my power, my ability to do something. And then lastly, I want to be safe. I want to be in relationships with people who understand my significance and my power. So we're all looking for significance, belonging, and safety. However, that safety, significance, and belonging may come in very different ways. And so how we achieve those things may be very different, but we all value very similar things. And so, Andre, what does that have to do with us in the workplace? I think it's important to recognize in the workplace that these are some pretty typical aspects of values: respect, integrity, compassion, healing, teamwork, innovation, excellence, stewardship. And I wonder which of those advance diversity, which one of those advance inclusion, which one of those actually advances the organization towards its goals. And I wonder if sexism, if racism, if Islamophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, religious bias, I wonder if any of those advance an organization or do they actually hold us back? And so I want you to think about that, particularly as we go through a couple of more slides. So in an organization that I work for, we did a climate assessment. And one of the things that we wanted to measure was how comfortable people felt in the organization. And what we found is that 77% of people who took the assessment found that they had to change something about themselves to fit in, which suggests to us that there's a gap between our intentions and our actual behaviors. And so what we strive to do is to really uncover that. And we recognize that this conversation about values isn't just about race or sex or gender, but it cuts across all sorts of lines. We also found that this happened to every category. So not only was it the LGBTQ community, was it the so-called blacks or women, but it also happened to straight white men, that they also felt that they oftentimes had to cover or hide parts of who they are. And so what I want to know or want you to think about is if 77% of people in an organization feel like they can't be their best selves, that they can't give their best efforts because they can't bring themselves to their full selves to work, what are we missing? What are the opportunities that we're missing? And so what becomes important is for us to recognize what our organizational values are that actually fuel us towards being successful. It's also important to recognize that values give us perspective. Is it about inclusion or is it about tolerance, right? So oftentimes people will talk about tolerance as if it is the end all be all, that this is the top of human ingenuity and enlightenment, right? But what we recognize is that tolerance just means putting up with until you no longer have to. Think about those relatives that stayed too long, right? You put up with them. You had tolerance for them. But when we think about this notion of inclusion, it certainly engenders a different way of thinking about how we engage with folks. And so including people in the process is very different than just tolerating them. What we also recognize is that it gives us purpose, right? And so values give us purpose. And so it's important to recognize that we can have equal opportunity or we can have reverse discrimination, right? And so what is this notion of reverse discrimination? That as a majority member of the culture, I am now the oppressed person of this new culture, given the change in demographics, change in all sorts of things. So we could look at things that way. I don't think that that's a right way to look at things. I don't think that's an effective way to look at things, but we could. But what we recognize is that our values give us purpose. And so our values say that we value equal opportunity. We value the opportunity for people to advance equally in this organization. And so historically, if that hasn't happened, then we're willing to and can make adjustments to that. Values also give us direction. So is it equality in service or is it equity of service? And we know that the answer is a trick question. That's a trick question because the answer is yes, it is both, right? So we can hold two different ways of thinking in our mind at the same time, right? We can have complex thoughts. And so values should drive everything we do. Values should influence how we create community, how we invite others in, how we navigate conflict, how we cross culturally communicate, how we share knowledge, how we treat people. Our values should be driving every aspect of our interactions. And how do we have D&I conversations using the values? How do we use the values to inform our interactions? And so the important thing to recognize is that we have to live these values. And so if we understand the values, then they inform all of those things, how we interact with folks. And our values give us courage. Right. So here in Minnesota, back in 2007, there was a 35W bridge collapse over the Mississippi River. And there were people who ran from their cars to save the children on this bus. And so they ran to the danger. So what would cause someone to run to danger? We can assume that not all of them were equipped EMTs, that they didn't have the right training or equipment. And so what drove them? Well, their values drove them. And so oftentimes when we're in situations where we don't know what to do, we can rely on our values to help fuel us, to guide us towards what we should be doing, right? Or what we could be doing in ways that we can help. And so our values give us courage. Our values also give us focus, right? They let us focus on what is important for our organization and not get sidetracked by unimportant behaviors, right? Off-purpose behaviors. Also, they give us solutions, right? They tell us how to respond to things that we don't necessarily have familiarity with, or we're not sure what to do. Our values also drive everything we do. Our values allow us to align our intentions, our values, and our behaviors, right? So whether I intended to do something or not, I can't be held accountable for my intentions. I can be held accountable for my behaviors. But if my behaviors are along my values, the spectrum of values, my organizational values, my personal values, then I can never go wrong. I can never go wrong. And so when we think about our values, how do we engage with these values? So when we act on our values, they drive our intentions. Our values, we use them to inform our decision making, and it helps us to align our intentions and our behaviors. And so when we think about all of these things, when we think about social unrest, when we think about how should we be operating in the world, it becomes important to recognize that our values fuel how we interact. Our values fuel how and what we do. And so as we think about and close this session, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing who you become, and let's be awesome.